Everybody has a story, and every story needs to be heard. On this podcast, we are talking with each member of the General Conference Leadership Council. I'm your host, Alyssa Truman, and this is A&N Profiles. Today, I'm here with Dr. David Trim. He is the director of the Office of Archives, Statistics, and Research. Hello, David.
Hello, Alyssa.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Good. So, the Office of Archives, Statistics, and Research. So, normally I don't allow people, not that I don't allow them, but normally we don't talk about what it is that people do because family ministries is pretty self-explanatory.
Yes.
Children's ministries these are departments we have in church. Most churches don't have an Office of Archives, Statistics, and Research. So, I'm going to let you give a little plug for what is the work of ASTR.
I'm happy to talk about that, and you're absolutely right. There are very few offices of archive statistics and research. There's one at the General Conference, there's one at the North American Division, one at the South American Division, and that's it. However, the functions of ASTR are being fulfilled at each level, administrative level of the church down to the conference. And actually, even at the local church, there are some of the functions being fulfilled. So we are responsible for the Archives and Records Management Program of the General Conference. So that means we're responsible for managing all its official records, everything that gets generated by the General Conference and its institutions and departments, its ministries. We also are responsible for collecting and publishing statistics and organizational information. So each year we publish the Seventh-day Adventist Yearbook and the annual statistical report. And that's where the local church comes in, because the only way we get statistics to publish for the global annual statistical report is by each local church reporting its statistics to the conference, which reports its statistics to the union, which reports its statistics to the division, and those to us. And likewise with the yearbook, the conference reports its information and it scales on upwards. We also are responsible for research. We do social science research surveys of church members to discover where the church is at, and that feeds into the strategic planning of the General Conference, and ASTR supports the strategic planning of the General Conference. So I'm the secretary of the World Church's Strategic Planning Committee, for example. And then the final function that we have, just since 2015, is publishing the Encyclopedia of Seventh-day Adventists, the ESDA or ESDA. I'm the editor, and then I have under me a managing editor, and we have a team of assistant editors and consultant editors around the world. So those are the four main things that ASTR does. But when it comes to the archive side, I should say we not only manage the World Church's records management program here at the World Headquarters, we also provide consultancy and training for archives programs around the world at both the division and union level.
Okay. I know this is your life story, but I really almost kind of wish this was something else because I really want to dig into the statistics and the research part, but that'll have to be a conversation on our own. So I remember the first time I saw you. I am one of these weird Adventists who enjoys watching annual council and spring meetings before I was employed by the church. I would do it for fun. I'm not sure there's many of us out there who do it
There's probably
just
a
for
minority.
fun. So I remember you would get up and you would do these presentations where you would talk about like year over year, the statistics, you would talk about all this different stuff. And it was probably always my favorite part of the whole presentation.
Definitely a minority then.
So I always remember, I was like, who is this guy? My sister and I would talk about you because she also would watch sometimes.
Oh, my.
And so we would talk about you and who is this David Trim? And so today we're here to answer that question. Who is David Trim? For me and for everybody else who, I guess in that minority, who has also watched or who just follows you because you're kind of a fun person to watch.
Oh, thank you, I think.
So, David, I know that you are from Europe, right?
Yes and no. Yes and no.
All right, so tell us where you're from.
I don't have a simple answer to that because I was born in India. Well, my parents were missionaries, and I spent my childhood in Australia. And then my family moved to Britain. And so, yes, I think of myself as being from Europe, from Britain. But I could also say that I'm from Australia or I'm from India.
Okay, so your parents were missionaries to India. Let's talk about that a little bit. What did they do? How did they serve? Tell us a little bit about your parents.
So my father was Australian. He passed away in 2016. My mother, who's still alive and just had her 92nd birthday, is British. So I have a blended heritage there. They were called from New Zealand, where they were then working in the mid-60s to work in India. And my father was initially a departmental director at the West India Union, which was then headquartered in Pune. Was then headquartered in Bombay, as it was then called, or Mumbai. They spent time in Pune, which is where the Adventist College, or Spicer Adventist University as it is now, but they were based in Bombay, and so I was born in Bombay, now known as Mumbai. So my father was initially a departmental director, and then he became union secretary.
Okay. And what did your mom do?
She did some teaching in the school, in the Adventist school, but chiefly she was a stay-at-home mother.
Okay. I personally, I have a strong affinity to that because I get to do that for 14 years of my life, and I loved staying home with my children. So she had you. Do you have siblings as well?
Yes, I'm the youngest of 5.
Youngest of 5.
Yeah, I have a brother and 3 sisters.
That is exactly what my husband has. That's a lot of siblings, though. That's a lot for a...
Yes. Yes, it made for a crowded car when we all went on a family outing, even given the fact that by the time I was sort of around 5 or so, my older sister had moved out, but there was still always 5 in the car if we went on a family trip when I was a child.
So how long were you in India?
I was born there, and then when I was 4, my parents and family moved to Sydney, which is where my father was from. My father was called to work in the Seventh-day Adventist Hospital there.
Okay, so do you have many memories?
I have a few memories. Also, I have, and I think this is probably common to many people, I have family memories because it was such an important part of my family's history that they would talk about it. And what's more, we would show slides. And one of our favorite things on a Friday night, after Sabbath had come in, was that my father would show slides of our family history. We called them look at me pictures because that was what one of my siblings had called them when they were young. And so I not only had heard stories about India, I knew with the pictures that went with them. And so you start to begin to wonder, do I have memories, or am I actually embodying the family memories? Because it's not only a picture, but it's a story that goes with it, which is what a memory is like. But I do have some memories that I know are mine, very minor things, nothing very significant. The swimming pool where my family would often go to swim because, of course, it's extremely hot. The room in which I had my playpen and playing with cars on the floor. But I have all these other family memories of time in India, so I feel that I remember it better than I actually do.
That's fair. I have some of those from California. I was born in California, but I have these like random memories, and I realize that they're not actually my memories. They're these family memories, or these things that kind of you just hear passed down.
Yeah. And I think everybody has that, but it becomes more potent when you actually have images to go with it, because you feel like, I remember what India looked like because of all these images.
So you moved to Sydney. Your dad's at the hospital. So most of your formative years, we would say, like early childhood memories, school years, were spent in Australia.
Sydney. Yes.
Okay. So did you attend an Adventist school there, or were you in a public school system? What is education like in Australia?
So initially I was at an Adventist school, and then it's slightly embarrassing to have to say this, but my mother actually, after they returned from India, went to university late in life, which at the time I just took for granted, but now I realize was quite extraordinary. And today, lifelong learning is a thing, and we all talk about that, and people will go to university at any stage in life. But in the early 70s, that wasn't the case. And so to be a woman in your 40s going to university must have seemed quite she would have been easily the oldest one in her class by some distance. But she went to university, which she'd always wanted to do. She'd done a teacher training course at an Adventist college and then went into teaching Adventist school and then married my father and was a pastor's wife and then was a mother. But so I was old enough that I could go to kindergarten and things, so she was able to study. So she actually got a degree in English, and then she did a teacher training qualification, and she got a job at what was then called the Catholic Teachers College, now part of the Catholic University of Australia, and she was training teachers. And so she had very pronounced opinions about the quality of education, and she was unhappy with the Adventist school that I was attending and didn't feel that it had the highest standards. So she pulled me out, and also, for that matter, my brother and sister who were at the Adventist High School in Sydney. And my brother went to a Presbyterian school. My sister went to an Anglican high school. And I initially went to a public school, probably partly because it was affordable for my parents. You know, you have three children. At that stage, my two older sisters, well, actually, no, one of my second older sister was still living at home. So that's quite a burden for just on a pastor's salary, though my mother was now teaching at college as well. So it must have been a strain, something of which I was never particularly conscious as a child. You know, I knew I couldn't have lavish toys and things, but I never felt that we were deprived.
Yeah.
Yes, deprived of things. So initially I went to a public school, but I found there that the language and the attitudes were rather rough, and so I actually went to my parents and said I'd like to go to a Christian school again because I find myself embodying these other attitudes. And literally that same year, a Pentecostal school had opened across the street from where we lived. It was a small school, only 100 students, which meant there was a very strong community feel, and a lot of pastoral care. And they invited people in the streets around to come and visit the school. So we did, and so I was sent there. And I went there through the end of primary school.
What do you think, because you were able to go to a school that was not Adventist, Pentecostal, how do you think that has altered your opinion of the Pentecostal movement? How has that helped you understand Adventism better? I know you were a kid, but there's still memories that...
Oh, yes. Yeah, very much so. So I have quite warm feelings about Pentecostals, about their sincerity and their religious experience, because and it was an extremely caring school. It couldn't have been more caring, and indeed it was a contrast to the Adventist primary school that I had gone to. I hate to say that, but it's the case, and I think that school has now changed, and it's more caring. But I can only speak about when I was a student there. So the Pentecostal school was extremely caring, very sincere people. However, there was a pressure on you to speak in tongues, to have the charismatic experience, and it was always extremely awkward for me to be the one who wasn't having it. And what happened was, and I'm sure this is true of many Pentecostals, that the charismatic experience of the gift of tongues is faked because you feel under pressure. You don't want to be one of the few people who aren't actually doing it. And I do wonder what percentage of Pentecostals actually have an authentic speaking in tongues experience. I have no doubt that some of them do, and where that comes from, I don't know. But I also know that at least at a school experience, many people are just mumbling or saying whatever comes into their mind because they don't want to be the one who stands out. And I always had to be the one who was unique and not taking part in the speaking in tongues experience.
Now, why did you choose not to, though? I mean, you're still a young kid. You could do something. I mean, because you said they were very kind and loving. Why not just play along? What in your mind as a young child thought, nope, this isn't for me?
Because it was theologically unsound. um, and that's what my father was a pastor, and so I talked with him about it, and we looked at the passages in Paul that talk about spiritual gifts, and speaking in tongues is there, but what my father said was that this was an actual gift of speaking real languages, not speaking some bizarre, supposedly heavenly language, and also that Paul himself says the gift of tongues is perhaps the least important, and you should seek other gifts instead. So, but perhaps most importantly, I never felt an actual sincere desire to. I never felt something just bubbling out of me that I should embody, and so I didn't wish to fake something, especially when I had doubts about whether it was about its theological bona fides anyway. So I just never felt comfortable. It was never authentic, and I never felt comfortable trying to counterfeit it.
I love that your father took you through the Bible, laid it out for you, explained to you why what you were observing was maybe not what the Bible was intending. I remember the very first time I saw speaking in tongues. I visited a Pentecostal college, and we walked into this room, and it was just everybody speaking. And I'd heard about this. You kind of hear about it, but it's something very different when you experience it.
It is. It's a little disturbing, and I think that was probably part of it as a child, to see adults apparently out of control. As a child, that is disturbing. But the after effect of this is that I am probably more suspicious of charismatic type experiences than perhaps I need to be. And so if in Adventist settings, and I do think Adventist worship in North America and some other parts of the world, but especially North America and say the Caribbean, is we're having Pentecostal influences come in without realizing it, without anybody actually saying, yes, this is a good thing, or no, this is a bad thing. And you do see no speaking in tongues, but you do see very enthusiastic responses to worship. And if I see somebody raising their hands in worship, I have an immediate reaction to it. And my wife says, well, if it doesn't hurt if that's what they feel moved to do, and it heightens their spiritual experience, then what sort of problem is it? So, and that's a reasonable observation, but just instinctively, because I associate that with Pentecostalism and with that the slightly strained expression that came when periodically we would have Pentecost, not just we had a regular worship service at that school, but it didn't usually end up in speaking in tongues, but periodically it would. They had the equivalent of a sort of week of prayer. You'd have a speaker come in for several days, and so periodically you'd have that, and it was very awkward and stressful. And so that's what I associate with people raising a hand or hands in worship. At the same time, Australia was Adventism was very staid. You wouldn't have a congregation saying Amen. That was just not something that happened. That was something Americans did. That was not something that Australians did. Not in a congregational setting. So it's now, I now will say amen enthusiastically in a sermon when the preacher says something I agree with, or in a meeting. But it's taken me a little time to get to that stage, and I sort of had to think about it. And I said, no, I think this is right. There's nothing inappropriate, but it's part of that influence of going to that Pentecostal school, and where there was a great deal of emotion and congregational response. And it sort of took me a while to separate it out and say there are things here that are both good and bad, and rather than associating everything negatively, I can say there are some things that are good and I don't mind doing those, and some things that are not so good and I will continue to refrain from.
I think that's so important for us too, is for us to sit here and to think through what, as we look at our childhood experiences or any life experience really, is that it's not always just 100% bad or 100% good. There's often this balance, and we need to search our souls, to think through like, what here is good? Do I really need to get rid of everything from that? And
I think that's right.
I think we struggle sometimes as Adventists a little bit with this. We don't want to get carried away, so we just create these kind of firm lines, but in doing so, maybe are not allowing the Holy Spirit to always move. It's a balance we have to kind of always strike, and something I think that internally we have to each process individually, which sometimes makes it a little bit hard because we're still trying to figure it all out. But so you were at this Pentecostal school, you said, through primary school.
And to the first year of high school.
Okay, so where did you go to high school?
I went to a Presbyterian, well, actually it was called the Uniting Church in Australia. The Methodists and Presbyterians and I think Congregationalists had all combined, but the school had originally been Presbyterian. But then it joined the Uniting Church. There were Presbyterians who held out, but the school passed into the Uniting Church. But the school chaplain was still very definitely Presbyterian. He was Scottish, so he was quite Presbyterian. So that was called Knox Grammar School.
Okay, so for high school you go to this
Uniting
Church school. This is actually quite interesting because you're very much an Adventist kid. Your father is a pastor, but you're being able to get exposure to understanding so many different people of different denominational backgrounds. Do you feel like often in your high school years, that's kind of when young people start to struggle a little bit more with their own core beliefs, and there's just some maybe more challenges that you try to find who you are as a person. Do you feel like this actually made you firmer in your beliefs, or did you have some of those struggles that maybe Adventism wasn't the right thing?
No, I never had that. I've always been convinced of the rightness of Adventist theological claims, especially the Sabbath and the Second Coming. I mean, indeed, at times I will sort of mentally take a pace back and reflect how astonishing it is that every church doesn't worship on the Seventh-day Sabbath, because it's so black and white. It's so obviously there in the Bible that it occasionally I do think it's really strange actually that the overwhelming majority of Christians don't keep the Seventh-day Sabbath. So that was very plain. The teaching about the Second Coming is very clear. And I was baptized when I was 12 or 13. I can't remember now which, but around that. If it would have been, if not 13, it would have been close to 13 when I was well into my 12th year. And I just never had any doubts about Adventist beliefs. And my father, being a pastor, studied with me and baptized me. So no, and perhaps it was in an odd way having the encounters with other faith traditions. Yeah, I guess one could say that would have made one doubt Adventism, but instead it made me appreciate Adventism more, I think. But it did mean I've never had the prejudices against people of other denominations that maybe some Adventists do, including Catholics, because my mother worked at a Catholic college, and because she worked in education, she actually worked with nuns, because of course in Catholicism there are teaching orders of monks and nuns, and it's a big thing with them, that it's part of their vocation. And so I knew from my mother, and I can remember at one time actually when I was studying with my father about the prophecies, saying something to my mother, and she was saying, well, no, that's in the future. The Catholics I work with are really lovely Christian people. And so while I can see fairly clearly certain realities about the Catholic Church as an institution, I've never had any prejudices against Catholics as people, or for that matter against other Protestants because of my experiences, and also I think just because of my parents' attitudes and what they modeled to us, which was that even though Adventism is the remnant church, there are Adventists who are not part of the remnant because they're not sincere, and there are people who will be part of the remnant in other churches. And so, there's every Christian church has got people who are honoring Christ and who we should honor therefore as well. So that was an important part of my growing up.
I love it. I see there's a lot of people who I've met with and talked with on these podcasts, and they've kind of gone through those struggles. I feel very similarly to you, though. I never actually questioned Adventist beliefs. It always just made sense. If you read your Bible, it kind of makes sense. I've never questioned whether Saturday was a Sabbath.
Right.
There's nothing in there that could make me think that it was on Sunday. And I think sometimes there's this part of me that always feels like I don't have a testimony. I don't have something because I did it. It's like I've always believed. And, my children are like, have you never doubted? And it's like, no, actually, I really haven't. And so you kind of almost feel like, left out. I know that sounds silly, but like
when one goes to a testimony service and you hear this and that, and it's like, well, I don't really have anything to say because I've just always known that this is right. It's very boring.
It's boring. But the thing is that there is a different kind of testimony in this, and that is of parents often who have raised us and helped answer so many questions that it made it so we never had to go through that period because we were able to dialogue, because your father sat down with you and explained the gift of tongues and stuff like this. You didn't need to doubt because it was explained so well. You were able to go back and forth. And I think this is a beautiful part of our testimony, is actually to the faithfulness of parents.
Yes. Amen to that.
So I just wanted to say, because there's probably some people who are listening who are in the same boat as us. And, we're used to these like, oh, and then I got into drugs and all these horrible things, but then God saved me. And it's like, yeah, I always believed in the Adventist message. It's like, so what about those of us, who say that? And I love that because it shows, though, that there has been other stuff. There's a different kind of a testimony that we don't honor nearly as much. So you finish with your high school experience at the
Uniting Church.
Uniting Church, because it's a new church name to me. I'm struggling remembering this. Uniting Church School. So now you've been in Pentecostal school, you've been in the Uniting Church School. Where do you go to college, David?
I went to Newbold College in England, which is an Adventist college.
Okay, so we end up in Adventism within the college here. So
definitely.
Now, Newbold is in England.
Yes.
And what did you decide you were going to go to school there what was your degree field?
So I was going to study history, and I went to Newbold because it's interesting. My 4 siblings all still live in Australia. But maybe because I was the youngest, my mother, who was British, sort of poured her love for England into me. I think maybe because, and I'm by some distance the youngest. Indeed, my mother had been told she wouldn't have any more children, and so it was very much a surprise. And in fact, she was advised, because of her health and because of her age, to terminate me. And
the church would have really missed out, David.
Well,
we're very happy.
Well, I mean, and I don't know about that, but my mother actually at one was asked for guidance and opened her scripture, opened her Bible, and opened it to the text that says, in your mother's womb I knew you. And so she felt at that stage that she had to go ahead, and she told her doctor in India this, and he said, well, that's fine. I will work with you to certain things you need to do to increase the chance that it will all go well. And of course it did. And my mother is, as I said, is still alive at 92. But so I was very much the youngest and unexpected. And so I think, she probably poured more of herself into me than into some of my siblings. Though at various points, at least 2 of my siblings did talk about moving to England. And in fact, one of my sisters did live in England for a period before going back to Australia. So at the time, and at the time I moved to Newbold, my parents had moved to England, or actually they moved just after me. In fact, it was odd. I left home and crossed halfway around the world, and then home followed me because my mother was actually offered a job at Newbold. And so my parents moved to England, which my mother had been wanting to do for some time, to go back to her homeland, though it was many years since she'd lived there. So that was why we had visited England, and I had visited Newbold, and so I knew where it was and had an idea of course I had no idea what it was like as a college, but I knew we'd visited it. It was a familiar concept to me, and so wanting to live in England was what I wanted to do, and so it naturally made sense to go to Newbold. And the thought was, if it all goes horribly wrong, then I could always go back to Australia and go to university there. But I went to Newbold, and within a week, I knew that I loved it.
So why did you say history?
Yes.
Yes. Why history? What brought you to this, like, I want to be a history, what? Were you going to be a teacher?
A historian.
Okay.
Yeah, great question, Alyssa. And there has never been a time when I haven't been in love with history. I can't remember a time when I wasn't interested in history, even as a quite small child.
Any specific period of history that you really have an affinity towards?
Oh, I mean, yes, but as a boy growing up, it was sort of many periods of history. As with many people who are enthusiastic about history, you narrow it down later. But by my late teenage years, I was particularly interested in the Tudors and the Stuarts. That's the 16th and 17th centuries. And as it happened at Newbold, I came under the influence of this wonderful Christian intellectual teacher, Dr. Harry Leonard, who hundreds, if not thousands, of Adventist young people were influenced positively by, because he taught at Newbold for more than 30 years. And he taught all the history classes, which meant everybody who took a general education class in history took a class from him. So people who were theology majors and as well as English and history majors or business majors all had to take a class from Harry Leonard. And his specialty was 16th and 17th century history. So I was already interested in that by the time I got to Newbold, and I did various personal research courses with Harry Leonard, which were on that period. So by the time I'd finished, I was clear that I wanted to study the 16th and 17th centuries. So the period after the Reformation and leading up to the English Civil War.
Okay. So were you hoping to be a teacher?
Yes. Well, I mean, yes.
What does one do with a history degree?
So I wanted to be an historian. I wanted to write and to publish, and I knew that the way one did that and also supported oneself was by teaching at a university or college. So, but there are those who want to become a teacher because they want to teach. They really like that idea. Whereas for me, it was always I want to do the research and the writing, and the teaching is what you have to do in order to support yourself.
Got it. History is what I always said. If I had to be a teacher, history was where I would go. It's either history or geography, but geography is often because it's tied into history.
Right. Well, you're clearly a very enlightened person.
Well, the interesting thing with geography is I've been born in America, never left America. Everything was always, I was an American. And I hated how ignorant Americans were when it came to geography. So when I had my children, one of the things I did was I actually made them memorize one summer all the countries in Europe.
Oh, wow.
And then one summer, we memorized all the countries in Africa. And we would always read different books about history and stuff. And
right.
I wanted them to know where these countries were and why it mattered. And
that's great.
I collected stamps with my grandmother. And
right.
that's how I started my interest in geography. It was because you started seeing these flags from around the world and
right.
you're collecting these
Where is it
stamps.
from?
And,
where is this place?
Yes. And, ooh, this is a pretty picture on this stamp. But no, history, it's a fascinating thing. And I think it kind of gets a bad rap. People are just like, but actually history is so enlightening. And if you understand history, you understand why we are where we are today. You can kind of start to understand maybe where we're going to go in the future.
That's right. And I think, I had the experience many times of, say, somebody has come round to the house to do repairs on the washing machine or the TV, or to install something, whatever it may be. And they ask you, oh, what do you do? And you say, oh, I teach history. And they'll pause and say, I didn't like history at school. That's very common. But I think that's not due to history. That's due to having a bad history teacher.
Yes.
And history can be taught in a very tiresome and tedious fashion. But it was surprising how often people who were older would then say, but now I realize that history is really important. And I think when you're young, you don't have much of a history yourself. And so there isn't the same appreciation for the value of history. Whereas somebody gets older, they have a history of their own, and they start to be interested in their family history, because now they're older, they're more interested in what their parents' experience was and their grandparents' experience. And they start to say, oh yeah, there is a history here, and it's important, and I don't know it, because I wasn't well taught, or I wasn't interested when I was younger. So I think many people have a negative experience with history at high school, and therefore have a negative reaction to history in general. But actually, I think it comes down to whether they're well taught or not. And also, even those who have a negative experience, as they become older, often start to say, yeah, I wish I knew more about history.
It's interesting that you say it, because one of the things I remember most is it was all these bold words in our history books. So it's like names, dates,
Right.
events. But we don't understand the reasoning behind it, the why. We don't wrestle with the, how does that impact us today? How did that impact how the country grew, or, whatever. So you kind of are focused on these names and dates. And the irony, though, is that now as an adult, I, sometimes do my own family genealogy. My husband and I do. So names and dates all of a sudden became important to us
Yes.
later in life. And I think you're right. It's like the older you get, you start to see this value of the history. I can trace my ancestors on my mom's side back to the Mayflower.
Wow, really? That's extraordinary.
Well, actually, we can go about 4 generations before that, but we know
That's wonderful.
We know who we were. We know the person on the Mayflower who came over here. It's a very interesting thing, and all these names and dates start to make an impact on who we are. We see who our history is, what the lineage is. But in school, it's just like memorize these so you can finish a test, which I think makes it so that history is not nearly as exciting. But I'm pretty sure if we were teaching history to everybody, they'd be thrilled.
Oh,
because
one would like to think so.
because we love it. So,
and actually, I think that does matter. And I was, if I may say so myself, a success as a teacher. I think it was partly just because I was enthusiastic about it. Even periods or areas that were outside my own area of expertise, when I taught about it, I became enthusiastic. And I think if one is enthusiastic oneself, then that is easily conveyed to other people. And so I think at least thinking that history is great does go a long way to helping other people to think that it's great as well.
I had a teacher who taught me about it was like early church history class. And so we went through Daubigny's History of the Reformation book. And
that would have been outdated by the time you did it, but that's another story.
But it was this, I remember going through this book, and I remember the teacher telling the stories. So rather than just reading them, he would tell us these stories. And I fell in love with these reformers. I fell in love with all these different stories that were taking place because he made it come alive.
Right.
And if you read the huge book, because it's a thick book.
Yes.
It's not super exciting on its own.
No. It's not.
It's not at all. I have read through the whole book, but the teacher was what made the difference. All right. So you finish your degree. Do you become a teacher right out of Newbold?
No, not immediately, because I knew I needed to do a PhD and I needed to earn some money. So it took me a couple of years, but then yes. And meanwhile at Newbold I'd got married.
Congratulations. And what is her name?
Wendy. And we had a daughter. So by the time I came to start my PhD, I was already married and had a little girl. So I went to King's College London, which is part of the University of London, and I did my PhD there in war studies.
A specific war? Or
Yeah,
just...
so my PhD thesis was on English soldiers serving in the French Wars of Religion and the Dutch Revolt against Spain, which are part of the European Wars of Religion, and is interesting because for most of the 50 years that I looked at, England was formally at peace, and yet you have English soldiers serving in France and the Netherlands, serving with the Huguenots, the French Calvinists, and the Dutch, who were revolting in revolt against Spain, and because it's a Catholic power. And so the interest was, were these English soldiers there serving as simply as mercenaries for money, or were they serving out of religious motivation? And I concluded that it was out of religious motivation.
So you finished your PhD, which, by the way, sounds very intriguing. I actually really love reading people's their papers. I love reading papers for fun. So I may find yours at some point. But you finished writing your paper. You're married. What does Wendy do?
At this stage, Wendy was working as a secretary.
Okay.
To help pay the bills, because I did get a scholarship, which included some money to live on, but not much. So we were actually desperately poor. There was one year in particular when we struggled, and we always knew our daughter would be okay. By this time, my parents had retired to living about an hour and a half drive north of us, and so we always knew our daughter would manage, because all her school holidays, we would take her up and she would spend the week with my parents, and they would feed her well and take care of her and do lots of fun things. But there were times in the one year in particular where we weren't sure where our next groceries were going to be coming from. And speaking of positive experiences with people of other denominations, there was actually one week we didn't have enough money to buy groceries, and one of the ladies who worked with my wife was a Jehovah's Witness, and she came back from lunch one day and said that she just felt impressed that we needed help, and she'd bought 2 bags of groceries for us. And no member of our own Adventist church ever did that for us. I don't wish to dwell on that too much. If we'd actually asked, probably somebody would have helped us. But a Jehovah's Witness was God's vessel in that occasion to help us. And so while, again, as an institution, I find the Jehovah's Witness organization to be, I have a fairly negative view of. Individual Jehovah's Witnesses I have to have a very positive view of, because one of them was God's instrument to help us. But then the scholarship went up, and we were all right, but we were still very poor. But so my wife was working as a secretary, and actually I didn't finish the thesis before I got the job. I got a job at Newbold. My mentor, Dr. Harry Leonard, retired, and they were looking for somebody to replace him, and so I had the honor of becoming his successor. But that was before I'd finished my thesis, or dissertation, as you would say here in the States. So I got the job at Newbold after 4 years of my PhD. But I hadn't yet finished the doctorate when I started teaching at Newbold.
Many people have never experienced not really knowing where their next meal is coming from. We can sit there and we say, "Oh, I'm starving." We don't actually know what starving is. We don't know what it's like to really be praying for, this miracle to be able to provide for our children. What do you think those 4 years did to help teach you more of a reliance on faith? How did that help you in your spiritual growth?
Yeah. Well, it made me lose a lot of weight. I'd been overweight.
I'm sorry.
I'd been overweight at the start, and I became almost gaunt at one point, especially when I was doing my research overseas. My wife would tell you that when I came back from my first research trip to Paris, you could see my ribs, because I had almost no money, and I lived on 2 meals a day, and neither of them were particularly ample. So I literally starved in a garret, which is sort of the romantic idea of a writer in Paris, and it's not particularly
Romantic.
It's not. It's not. You get through it. But what I did start on that same research trip was actually reading my Bible through. And I'd always had a Bible, and I'd always dipped in and out of it, and I'd done Bible classes, and I'd done Sabbath school and Pathfinders, and you do some Bible study, and you memorize Bible texts and so forth. But I'd started as a boy trying to read the Bible through, and I read the first few chapters of Genesis, and then I got to the begats. And it was like, is the whole Bible like this? And I never got past it. And so I'd never actually read the Bible through from Genesis to Revelation. And I started doing that on that first research trip to Paris. And then I kept doing it. And I've done it ever since. I read the Bible through, and then I start again, and then I read it through. And so that started during that period. And I learned more during those years, I learned more about God and His character and His purposes, and I felt closer to Him.
I think sometimes it's these hard times in life where even though we have not struggled with believing the Adventist message, that God uses these harder times for us to have that growth, that further connection with Him that just doesn't come as naturally during the easy times.
Yes.
So do you know how many times you've read through your Bible?
I do. I actually have. I write down in the front of the Bible when I start and finish, but I don't recall now offhand how many times.
Do you have
it
a
is.
general idea?
It's about 9, I think.
Okay, so which is actually a really big deal. I've done a lot of research into biblical literacy and stuff like that. Actually, a lot of people, a majority of Christians have never read the Bible cover to cover. It's a very, very, very small percentage. And a lot of us will read, book here, book there. My oldest daughter actually read through her entire Bible with my husband, I think when she was 12 or 13. They would wake up every morning, and they'd spend 30, 40 minutes every morning before she went to school, and she read through her whole Bible with him. My husband does this.
Actually.
My husband does this every year. He reads through his Bible like every year, and he does the same thing you do. He writes down the dates and stuff like that. I've never read it through from Genesis to Revelation. I've read every book in the Bible.
Yes.
But I've never read it through.
Which
I'm okay with. I still think I've read through the Bible, but just not that.
It gives you a different perspective. And I mean, you do start to see the commonalities. You do start to see, yes, okay, this is 66 different books, and they all have different authors. Indeed, several of the books have multiple authors just of the book itself. And yet there is a commonality, and we can talk about this as a book as well as being a collection of books. So I think reading it through that way helps give you that sense of here are the common threads. This is what the Bible as a whole is saying. So it is a blessing.
If you could encourage people to read through their Bibles, because there are, again, many people who have never done this, what would you say would be the biggest benefit you think that they would gain from reading the Bible from Genesis to Revelation?
A clearer understanding of the character and purposes of God.
In what way?
That you see the way God works with people throughout history. That you see the way God's character is manifested. You can see there are things that are deeply puzzling and even troubling. But overall, you start to get a picture of this is who God is, and He works with us even though we're flawed and human, and human society is terrible. and violent and immoral, but God works with us, and He tries to move us in the direction that He would to be closer to His pattern. We'll never achieve perfection. I don't believe that. We don't achieve perfection in this life. But God tries to move us closer to the divine pattern, which is better for us now, but also it makes us more likely to be saved in the hereafter.
So you move to Newbold, you start teaching, and you take Dr. Leonard's place. What was it like to be a teacher and to follow in the footsteps of this great man?
So at first it was a learning curve, and nobody ever had taught me how to be a college teacher. That's probably a weakness. Even in American, so British PhDs, you just do research. You might do a course on sources and methodology. And if you're working in my sort of period, something on paleography, though I didn't even do that. But it's chiefly research and writing. An American PhD, you do courses, and you'll often do part-time teaching as part of your doctorate. But even there, I know from talking with Americans who did people who did their PhD in America, that they were never taught how to be a university teacher. So I was in the position of both of just trying to do what I had seen Dr. Leonard do and other teachers at Newbold, and at the same time, though, not wanting just to try to be like him, because here is a man who is a legend, literally, and who for 30 years has put his stamp on Adventist young people, so that you have people now in their 50s who are sending their children to Newbold to study under the man who taught them. So it was a mistake. I remember thinking at the time, it's going to be a mistake to try to be like him, or be like him, but more so. And I had seen one faculty member for a short time. There was a second teacher in history, and he tried to be Harry Leonard, but more so. And it failed because it wasn't authentic. He was trying to put something on. And so it was like, right, I can't do that. So I was both trying to emulate him and at the same time be who I was and not who he was. So that was interesting, learning how to mark. And fortunately, I had Harry's help there. He would review papers that I got in, and we would look and compare marks and compare comments, and I could see, okay, yeah, I need to be more like this in this area. So it was interesting, but I took to it pretty quickly, and I enjoyed it.
How many years did you teach?
I taught 10 years at Newbold and then 2 years at Pacific Union College.
I don't think I knew you went to PUC.
Yeah.
So Pacific Union College is in England,
California,
United States?
Near San Francisco, yeah.
Okay. So when you were at Newbold, you spent 10 years there, and you always taught history?
Yes.
Correct?
Well, no, I also taught other things as well, because it's a small college. So I taught master's courses in hermeneutics and missiology and history of the interpretation of the apocalypse, because the theology program had a master's program, and I taught all those courses in the master's program. But I also taught some English literature, and there was one semester a colleague was on research leave to work on his PhD, and I taught film studies. So
you've taught a lot of different things.
Yes, and
Okay.
I've also taught general undergraduate religion. I've taught the basic, wasn't even Religion 101, it was Religion 100. God and Human Life, or some such title, because none of the theology teachers wanted to teach it, so they put it on to me. So yes, I've taught all kinds of things.
Okay, so when you went to PUC, you took a call to PUC. Why would you want to leave Newbold to come to America, which is not a country that your family's here, and you could go back to Australia. Why Pacific Union College?
So Wendy's from California.
Ah.
She never studied at PUC. She went straight to Newbold and met me there, and so she'd lived in England for 20 years, actually. And that was interesting because she, of course, thought I understand California, but California had changed in the 20 years, and she'd spent lots of times visiting her parents and family. But it's not the same as living there. So I won't say there was culture shock, but there was some some cultural adaptation that was needed. So also Newbold at that stage was going into a decline, for various reasons which we don't need to get into here, and it was becoming a bit grim, frankly. And so I just lost my sense of conviction that Newbold was going in the right direction and that I was contributing to it. So when the opportunity came to go to Pacific Union College, we took it. And it was partly, we had lived 20 years in England, being close to my parents, that it was time to be closer to Wendy's family for a little while at least.
So you were at PUC for 2 years and mostly teaching...
History. Just history.
Okay, just history there. How do you think that experience compared, just like educationally, the difference between...
Yeah, so that's a great question. So one of the differences is that in Britain, marking is all what we call cross-marked. That means a colleague marks everything as well as you do as well. And then you can, if you have given the same mark, that's fine. But if you're some distant apart, you need to talk and reconcile the grade. And so that meant if students were unhappy with the grade, you would say, well, look, it's been marked and cross-marked. There's been 2 sets of eyes on it, and this is what we think. And so students would say, okay. What I found teaching even American students at Newbold was that American students would try to bargain to get a better grade. And so at PUC, there was no cross-marking. In fact, at one point, I remember my first quarter there was an exam that was one of those things that it's got really good things in it, but it's also got really bad things in it. So what do you go with? And I asked a colleague if he would mark it and give me his assessment. And he was like, no, because to him that undermined your academic independence. Even just talking about the idea of cross-marking, some of my colleagues at PUC were like, "Oh, what a great idea," and others sort of sent a shiver up their spine. This was
It's actually really kind of a cool idea, because you as a student always feel like, okay, this is a fair grade. Like 2 people have evaluated this. It's not just a subjective, like, oh, the teacher doesn't like me, so he graded it this way.
Exactly. If it's just one person, it can feel arbitrary. And also what happens in small colleges, and Newbold was very small, PUC was small, is that certain students become identified as either talented or not talented. And then the teacher knows that when they come into the class, and sometimes marks according to their perception rather than to what's actually the reality. And so there was one student at PUC whose GPA was something like 3.99, because every class he had an A in, except the one he took from me where he got an A minus. But he said to me afterwards he was prouder of that A minus than many of the A's he got, because I hadn't come in. I didn't know that he was the gifted he was the gifted student. So I didn't know that, so I just marked what was in front of me. Also, I do think America is more inclined to grade inflation than Europe. And so I marked harder than probably anyone else at PUC, just because I was marking to British standards rather than American standards.
Interesting.
But the students, apart from the fact that they try to bargain with you to improve their grade, which I found irksome, the students were enthusiastic. They wanted to learn. It was the same at Newbold. There were always a few who were there because their parents had sent them there, but on the whole, students were intelligent. They were thoughtful. They wanted to learn, and it was good to teach there.
So I'm going to ask a question, short answer, because I want to get to the next couple of years. You did not go to Adventist Education through your childhood, and it sounds like you've been through some hard times in some of our Adventist schools. Why should we send our kids to Adventist schools?
Because generally the quality is very high. We know that from studies that have been done, the cognitive genesis study that's been done out of La Sierra University, but also because Adventist schools educate for eternity. That is one of the slogans that they use, but it's true. And so we know empirically that Adventist education correlates with staying in the church. Adventist education predicts that you will stay in the Adventist church. Not that being in the Adventist church is a precondition of being saved for eternity, but we would like our children to stay in the Adventist church, not just for the sake of the future, but also because being an Adventist makes things better in the here and now. You're a better person and you live a better life if you're a Seventh-day Adventist. I believe that. So that's why Adventist education matters and why we should send our children to Adventist schools. And though I had the negative experience at an Adventist primary school, my experience being a student at Newbold was wholly positive, and my experience teaching at Adventist colleges was a positive one, and I believe that students who go to Adventist colleges have a blessing from it. So I'm a strong supporter of Adventist education.
I am too. But I just want to hear what your thoughts were there. So you finish your time at PUC. Where do you go from there?
So in 2010 at Annual Council, I was elected by Annual Council to be the Director of Archive Statistics and Research. That didn't come as a surprise. I had actually, as it were, applied for the position, or not exactly applied, but I had been my predecessor as the Director of Archives and Statistics, as it then was, he was going to cease to be director at Annual Council 2010, and in the summer of 2010 was the General Conference session, and the new Undersecretary was somebody I knew. And so he suggested that I could be a good fit for the Director of Archives and Statistics. So I sent my CV in, and I was asked to interview. And I happened to be in Washington, D.C., so they didn't have to fly me out. I was in Washington, D.C. doing some research. And so I interviewed, and at the end and they asked me to prepare a presentation, a 5 to 10 minute presentation that as if I was giving one for the GC officers on some aspect of statistics. So I did that, and I talked about something that had concerned me for a while, which is people leaving the church.
You talk about that a lot.
I do.
It seems to be a trend. 42%, wasn't that the number for this year?
42%, 42.5% is the percentage who leave the church over the last 50
I
years.
listened to you,
yes,
David.
No,
Just in case you thought I didn't. I listened to you.
I'm very impressed. Alyssa. But so I was moved to do something on that, and I remember thinking, well, this could really ruin my chances because maybe the General Conference Secretary doesn't want to hear about that. But actually, as you may recall, the previous GC Secretary, Dr. G.T. Ung, was very passionate about members leaving the church.
Yes, he was.
So without knowing it, I was talking exactly his language. I was singing his song. And at the end of the interview, which went on longer than it was supposed to, GT said to me, "Can I use something from your presentation in my secretary's report to Annual Council?" And of course I said yes, and I remember thinking, well, this has gone about as well as it's possible to go. And so I sensed that they were going to offer me the position. So then I had to reflect, did I really want it? And I prayed about it, and I asked God for a sign, and actually he gave me 2 signs. So I said, yes, I'm willing for my name to go forward, and at Annual Council I was elected.
So you've now served in this position for 13 years, right? Approximately? You said 2010?
Yeah, it took time for the visa and everything to come through, though, so I only actually first started at the GC in February of 2011.
Okay.
So it's coming up for 13 years.
Okay, so about 13-ish years. You've grown the department. There's a lot of new things that have come from it. Like you said, the Encyclopedia of Seventh-day Adventism.
Yes, and it's become archive statistics and research. Yes.
So what would you say, not that you're close to retirement, but let's just think about like 10 years from now, like legacy. What is it that you would like to say that while you were here, this is what how you've helped the church. What is it that you hope for ASTR to do missionally, even down to the local church member level? What in your heart do you really would love to say and see?
That's a great question, Alyssa, and I have not actually asked myself that in those terms, so I have to think about it. There are probably two things. One is, and this was something that I consciously felt I wanted to do starting back in 2011, is that I wanted to make church leaders addicted to data. That at that stage, the way decisions were made at the General Conference, and I think at many other levels, was depending who gave a good speech in an executive committee or a session or a constituency meeting. It was the best orator. Somebody got up and said, let's do this. And it wasn't based on evidence. And it was like, yes, somebody gets up and gives a great speech and they ring the right Adventist bells, they use the right Adventist buzzwords, and everybody says, amen, brother, and it's voted. And then also there's never any assessment of, did this work? Did it work well? Was the money that we spent on this well invested or not? So I wanted to move the church towards evidence-based decision-making, and I wanted to make church leaders so used to using data that when I came to leave the position, they would continue to do that because they would expect it. And I think actually we've got to that stage, Alyssa. I think now church leaders expect to hear some data first.
Yeah, I would agree with that. We like our data. We want to know we're making informed decisions, not just the best orator, as you said.
Yes, yeah. So I think that's been achieved, and I think when I leave this position, the church will continue to do surveys, it will continue to do statistical analysis, it will continue to do deep analysis of things, and people will expect to hear those things cited before they make a decision, and will make decisions based on that. And I think I also wanted that to spread down, not only to be at the GC, and I think it's spreading to divisions, and I hope it's spreading to unions as well. I think hopefully we're modeling that. And so I think it's been achieved at the world church level, and now we need it to be adopted going elsewhere in the church's structure. The second thing is promoting Adventist history. Promoting rigorous, robust scholarship on Adventist history, but also sharing the results of that in user-friendly ways. So I would like to see more of both. And actually in the archives, we've started our own book series, the General Conference Archives Monographs, and we've published 3 books so far with a 4th coming out.
I did not know about these books.
Yeah. So the first one was a history of the church's missionary enterprise and the role of secretariat in it. The second is an overview history of mission in China. The third is a study of a prominent Adventist historian who lived through the years of controversy in the 70s and early 80s, Walter Utt. And the 4th coming out, that will be coming out hopefully next year, is a history of the church in the Middle East.
I'm excited. I want to read them all the books.
Well, they're all available on Amazon, Alyssa. So just go to Amazon and you'll be able and search for David Trim, and it should
search for David Trim. Okay.
And it should.
He's like, here's a plug.
Yeah, and it should bring up the. Well, I if I tell you the titles, you won't remember.
It's true.
So the easy thing is to remember my name. But if you have any trouble, let me know, and I will.
We'll figure it out.
I'll send you the links. But you can buy them all on Amazon. We've priced them all very affordably. So we are doing research. We've held conferences here. We've helped sponsor conferences elsewhere as well. So we are doing that rigorous scholarship, but at the same time it is necessary, I think, for that to be popularized. And so I've published 2 books with Pacific Press. A 3rd is coming out next year for the 150th anniversary of the Church's Foreign Mission Program.
You also have a podcast. I want to
Yes.
pitch another podcast while we're on
Thank
this
you.
podcast.
Thank you.
Pitch that podcast, and then we're going to wrap up. But pitch the podcast.
Mission 150, which I co-host with Sam Nevis, your colleague in GC Communication. Originally, it was every week. Now it's every other week. But it is, again, for that 150th anniversary of the Church's foreign mission, which is next year. But we started this year to sort of build awareness of it. We tell the history, but we also interview recent and current missionaries about their experiences. So we told, for example, that the 150th anniversary is of John N. Andrews going as the Church's first foreign missionary to Switzerland. So we had 2 episodes on him as our second and third episodes. And then later we interviewed his, I think, great-grandson or great-great-grandson, probably great-great-grandson, who'd been a missionary in South America, a student missionary, and is a student at Southern. So there's a nice symmetry there. So it's mostly history, but we also tell stories of recent and current Adventist missionaries. So our tagline is, we tell stories from the history of Adventist mission around the world. So Mission 150, you can watch it at adventistreview.tv, or you can listen to it on any podcast platform. It's on all the audio podcast platforms.
And I highly recommend it. As someone who is an Adventist history nut, it's really interesting. And I actually was able to sit in on the first couple ones you guys were doing, and it was even better watching in real life. But now I have to be doing my job at the same time, so I have to just listen to them online. But David, I just want to tell you how much I appreciate sitting down and talking with you. Ironically, finding out how much we have in common. I didn't realize that. In my mind, you're just like this really amazing,
You're very kind. Thank you.
You're somebody I've always looked up to at the General Conference.
Well, thank you.
And I've admired and I respected deeply. And I just, being able to get to know you on more personal level has been a real privilege and an honor for me. So thank you for coming and sitting here with me.
Thank you for having me with you, Alyssa, and thank you for the excellent questions. You've made me think about my own life.
Well, praise the Lord. We hope you enjoyed this episode of A&N Profiles with my special guest, David Trim. If you haven't already, please take a moment to subscribe to our podcast or the YouTube channel, wherever it is you're tuning in from today. We don't want you to miss any future episodes. Thank you for spending this time with us, and join us next week as I continue to get to know the life stories of more inspiring people.